The Great Pyramid was already nearly 2,500 years old on the day Cleopatra was born. She lived closer in time to the first landing on the moon than to the men who cut those stones. Most of us carry an assumption that gap destroys. That ancient Egypt was a period. It was not a period. It was a civilization that ran for roughly 3,000 years. And it did not run smoothly. Its central government fractured at least 3 times. Famine, civil war, foreign rule. And each time, the country reassembled itself. That is the real question in this story. And it is almost never the one that gets asked. Not how the stones were moved. We know a great deal about how the stones were moved. And we will show you the evidence. The question is, what holds a society together for 30 centuries? And what finally happens when the thing holding it stops working? This is the whole arc. From the first kings to Cleopatra. And from the last hieroglyphs to the scholars who learned to read them again. Chapter 1. The Invention of Egypt. There is a slab of dark green stone in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo that is smaller than you expect. About 2 feet tall, shield-shaped, smooth, carved on both faces. Walk past it without knowing what it is, and you would give it 4 seconds and move on toward the gold. That would be a mistake. It is one of the oldest surviving works of political communication that we can still read and interpret. It is called the Narmer palette, and it was pulled out of the ground at a site in southern Egypt called Hierakonpolis in the winter of 1897 and 1898, by 2 British archaeologists named James Quibell and Frederick Green. On one face, a king swings a mace over a kneeling captive. He wears a tall white crown. On the other face, the same king walks in procession past rows of beheaded enemies. And now, the crown is different. A flat red one with a curl at the front. That switch of headgear is the entire message. White crown for the southern valley. Red crown for the northern delta. One man, both crowns, one country. That is the founding story of Egypt as Egypt chose to tell it. A single king, a single victory, a single moment when 2 lands became one. We are going to take that story apart. Because what happened is slower, messier, and considerably more impressive than a man with a mace. Begin with the ground itself, roughly 2,000 years before that palette was carved. When the Sahara was green, around 9,000 years before the birth of Christ. And for several thousand years after. North Africa was not desert. Monsoon rains reached far north of where they reach today. The evidence is not speculation. It sits in lake sediments, in fossil pollen, in the bones of hippopotamus and elephant recovered from places that now see almost no rain, and in rock art painted across the central Sahara, showing herds of cattle where there is now nothing but sand. People lived out there. They herded. They made pottery. They buried their dead. At a place in the southern Egyptian desert called Nabta Playa, they raised standing stones beside a seasonal lake. Some researchers argue the arrangement tracks the sun and certain stars. Others are more cautious about how much astronomy can be safely read into a circle of stones. Both positions are held by serious people. And for the deep past, the confident version is usually the wrong one. Then, the rains failed. The drying came in phases across centuries. And its human consequence is the most important fact in this entire story. As the grassland died, the people on it moved toward water. And in this corner of the world, there was one place to go. A single river running north through a trench in the rock, with green on either bank and killing desert beyond that. Egypt was not founded on the Nile because the Nile was pleasant. Egypt was founded on the Nile because the alternative was death. Compress an entire regional population into a strip of floodplain a few miles wide, with no room to walk away from each other. and you will get either constant war or organization. Egypt got both. In that order. The river then did something unusually valuable for the people who settled beside it. Its flood was comparatively regular and predictable. Summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands sent a surge north that arrived around the same weeks every year, spread across the fields, and left behind a fresh layer of black silt. The Egyptians named their country after that soil. Kemet, the black land. The desert, on either side, was Deshret, the red land. And that is where they buried people. Compare Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates flooded violently and unpredictably, and sometimes destroyed everything. The Nile was generous. But the thing that mattered more was that it was punctual. A punctual river can be planned around. You can build a calendar on it. You can decide when to plant, when to dye channels, when to collect what is owed. Egypt was not blessed with a magic river. Egypt was blessed with a schedule. One piece of geography before we go on. Because school maps get it backward. The Nile flows north. So south is upstream. Upper Egypt is the southern part, the narrow valley. Lower Egypt is the northern part, the wide fan of the delta. When a king unites Upper and Lower Egypt, he unites south and north in that order, and the south does the uniting. Egyptian politics never stops being a conversation between a narrow valley and a broad delta that do not entirely trust each other. So who were these people? Before there were pharaohs. Archaeologists sort them by their pottery and their graves, naming the phases after the villages where the material was first identified. The Badarian culture in the 5th millennium before Christ, then a sequence usually labeled Nakada 1, 2 and 3 through the 4th. The evidence is not glamorous. Broken pots, flint blades, cosmetic palettes for grinding eye paint, beads, and bodies laid on their sides in shallow pits. But line those graves up in time order and something happens in front of you. In the early graves, almost everyone gets roughly the same treatment. A pit, a body, a pot or two, then, over generations, the graves separate. A few get bigger. They get lined with mud brick. They get more goods. Better goods. Goods that traveled. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Copper, gold from the eastern desert. Cedar from Lebanon. Meanwhile, the ordinary graves stay about the same as they always were. You can watch a ruling class being born in the size of holes in the ground. That is not a figure of speech. It is the archaeological record, and it is one of the clearest pictures of the birth of social inequality anywhere on Earth. By the later 4th millennium, 3 southern centers had pulled ahead: Hierakonpolis, Nakada, and Abydos. At Hierakonpolis, there is a painted tomb, known as Tomb 100, showing in boats, figures, and a man striking down prisoners. That striking pose is already there. Centuries before Nama, at Abydos, in a tomb labeled Uye, excavators found small bone and ivory labels marked with signs. Those labels are among the earliest writing found in Egypt, dated to roughly 3,200 years before Christ. And here is what they appear to say. Nothing poetic. They record quantities and places of origin for goods, most likely oil and linen. The first Egyptian writing we have is a set of shipping tags. In the next chapter, that becomes the hinge of the entire civilization. Now, unification. The Egyptians themselves. Much later, said the first king was a man named Menes. Our fullest king list comes from an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who wrote in Greek in the 3rd century before Christ, more than 2,500 years after these events. His original work is lost. What survives are quotations of it inside other authors. That is a long chain of custody, and it should make us careful. Modern scholars generally connect Menes either with Narmer or with a king named Aha, who came shortly after. The identification is not settled, and anyone who tells you it is settled is offering certainty. The evidence does not contain. What the archaeology shows is that the south did not conquer the north in one afternoon. Southern pottery styles, southern burial customs, and southern goods appear in the delta gradually, over generations. Before any unification event, some of that spread was trade, some was migration, some was very likely violence. And there are mass graves and injured skeletons from the period that support it. The process looks like centuries of pressure, absorption and consolidation, ending in a final political act that somebody then took credit for, which returns us to the green stone in Cairo. The Narmer palette is not a photograph of a battle. It is a claim. It was made after the fact, by the winners, to compress an untidy multi-generational process into one image of one man, larger than everyone else on the object, holding a weapon over a smaller kneeling figure who cannot fight back. The size difference is not clumsy drawing. Scale in Egyptian art states rank, and this is the first surviving example of a rule that will govern Egyptian imagery for the next 3,000 years. Every nation does this. Every nation files a long, morally complicated origin down into one clean scene with one hero in it. What makes Egypt remarkable is not that it did this. It is that Egypt did it in stone, this early, and did it so effectively that we are still repeating its version 5,000 years later. The truth underneath is better anyway. A population driven against a river by a dying climate, squeezed together until it had to invent a way to live at that density, spending 500 years building the habits of a state before anyone put on a crown. And the state that emerged had a shape no ruler had ever had to govern before, around 700 miles long, in most places only a few miles wide. No king could see it. No king could ride it in a season. A country shaped like a piece of string cannot be governed by a man being present. Chapter 2. Writing, Grain and the Machine. Somewhere between 1% and a few % of the Egyptian population could read and write. Nobody can put a firm number on it, and the estimates by scholars who have worked the problem, among them John Baines and Christopher Eyre, sit at the low end of that range for most periods. The exact figure matters less than the scale. In a country of perhaps 1 to 2 million people, the number who could handle a written record was a small professional class, and no more. The overwhelming majority of ancient Egypt could not read a single sign of the writing that we now use to define ancient Egypt. That changes what the hieroglyphs actually were. We tend to imagine them as a national language in pictures, carved on temple walls for everyone to admire. They were an instrument, held by specialists, and their earliest surviving uses are overwhelmingly practical, identifying rulers, places, goods, ownership, and quantities. The system had 2 forms, and the difference between them tells you how this state functioned. Hieroglyphs are the formal script, beautiful, slow, carved in stone or painted on tomb walls. Nobody ran a country in hieroglyphs. Alongside them, Egyptian scribes developed a fast cursive form called hieratic, written with a reed brush on papyrus. Hieratic is what the machine ran on. It is quick, plain, and functional, and there is far more of it than there is of anything carved. Papyrus mattered as much as the script. Egyptians sliced the stem of a marsh plant into strips, laid them in 2 crossed layers, pressed them, and dried them into sheets that could be joined into rolls. It was light. It was storable. A single messenger could carry a decision hundreds of miles along the river. A stone inscription tells you what a king wanted, remembered forever. A papyrus roll tells you what a village owed last season. And it travels to the king, instead of the king traveling to it. That is one of the foundations of government at a distance. What did they count? Grain. Above all, also cattle. Land. Linen. Oil. Labor. And people. The state took a share of what the land produced, stored it, and paid it back out as wages, rations, and reserves. There was no coinage in Egypt for most of its history, for roughly 2,500 years. The wealth of one of the ancient world's richest states was measured in sacks of emmer, wheat, and barley, and in jars of oil and beer. Which raises the obvious problem. How do you plan around a harvest that has not happened yet? The Egyptians measured the flood, anilometer is, at its simplest. A set of marked steps or a marked shaft cut into the riverbank where the height of the annual inundation can be read against a scale. Over time, those measurements let officials anticipate agricultural conditions. And in later periods, they were explicitly associated with assessment and taxation. Most of the surviving Nilometers are late. So we should be careful about projecting a single national system back across 3,000 years. But the principle was old, and the state took it seriously. We know that because of an object called the Palermo stone, a fragmentary royal annal carved on dark stone, named for the museum in Sicily that holds the largest surviving piece. It lists early kings year by year, and among the events recorded for each year, beside festivals and the making of statues, it records the height of the Nile flood, a national annal that treats the water level as headline news. So the scribe was not a clerk in the modern sense. He recorded the flood. He assessed the fields. He counted the cattle. He registered grain into the granary and out of it. He drafted labor. He wrote the letters that carried decisions up and down 700 miles of river, and he was one of the very few routes of advancement available to a man born without land or rank. There is an Egyptian text, usually called the Satire of the Trades, written as a father, telling his son that every other occupation is misery, and the scribe alone is spared. It is propaganda for a profession, produced by that profession, and it is also one of the earliest surviving arguments that education is a ladder. Two more pieces, and they are the ones people skip. The calendar. Egyptians ran a civil year of 365 days, 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 added at the end, divided into 3 seasons, named for what the river was doing: inundation, emergence, and harvest. This is a calendar built for agricultural administration. It also drifted, because the true solar year is roughly a quarter of a day longer, and they did not correct it. So the civil calendar slid steadily out of step with the seasons across centuries. That drift is now a gift to historians, because certain recorded astronomical events can be tied to a calendar we can reconstruct. And standardized measurement, length in cubits, based on the forearm, subdivided into palms and fingers, with physical reference rods kept as standards. Several survive in museums. This sounds like the dullest possible subject until you consider that without it, you cannot assess a field, specify a quantity of grain, contract labor, or build anything large with more than one crew working on it. Now, the part of this system that has nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with why any of it was worth doing. The Egyptians had a word for the thing the whole apparatus existed to protect: ma'at. It is usually translated as truth, or order, or justice. And none of those is quite right, because it covers all three at once, and something more. Ma'at was the correct arrangement of the world. The river rising on time, the sun crossing the sky, the fields producing, the courts judging fairly, the son burying the father, the king on the throne. It was cosmic order and social order treated as a single continuous thing. And it was understood to be under permanent threat from its opposite, which the Egyptians called isfet, chaos, disorder, the state of things when nobody is holding them together. The king's function, stated on monument after monument for 3,000 years, was to uphold Ma'at, not to expand territory, not to enrich himself, to keep the arrangement running. That is the theology of the granary. Every measurement of the flood, every assessment of a field, every sack of grain moved into storage against a bad year, was a religious act as much as an administrative one, because keeping the country fed and ordered was the literal work of holding chaos off. The Egyptian bureaucracy was not a secular institution with a religion attached. It was the religion, executed. Ma'at was also personified as a goddess, shown as a woman with a feather on her head. And that feather is going to matter enormously later in this story, when we reach what Egyptians believed happened after they died, which brings us to a king named Djoser, around 2,670 years before Christ. Before Djoser, Egyptian royal tombs were built of mud brick in a flat, rectangular form. Archaeologists call a mastaba, from the Arabic word for bench, impressive and perishable, at Saqqara, on the desert edge above Memphis. Djoser's people created the earliest surviving monumental complex, built extensively in cut stone, and then they stacked it. The step pyramid began as a large mastaba and was enlarged in stages, one layer set on another, until it stood as 6 receding tiers, about 200 feet high. Around it they built a complex enclosed by a stone wall over a mile long, filled with buildings that are not buildings. Many of the structures are solid. They have false doors that do not open. Stone columns, carved to imitate bundled reeds, and stone roofs, cut to look like timber logs. The builders were translating an entire architectural vocabulary out of mud and wood and reed into limestone, because limestone lasts, and lasting was the whole point. You cannot build that without a stable food surplus, which requires the flood and the granaries. You cannot organize it without records, which requires scribes and papyrus. You cannot cut and fit the blocks without standard measurement. You cannot feed and house the crews without a supply system reaching across the country. The step pyramid is not the beginning of Egyptian genius. It is the receipt, and unusually for this date, we have a name attached to it. In 1926, excavation at Saqqara under Cecil Firth recovered fragments of a statue base of Djoser, carrying, beside the king's titles, the name of another man, Imhotep, described with administrative and priestly titles. For a non-royal individual to appear on a royal monument at this period is extraordinary. That statue base is the reason we can say anything solid about him. Everything else came later, and much later, across the following 2,000 years. Imhotep was elevated in Egyptian memory into a sage, then a patron of medicine, then a god with his own cult, and finally identified by the Greeks with their healing god Asclepius. It is one of the most complete promotions in human history, from official to deity, and almost none of it can be verified from his own lifetime. Hold that gap between the man on the statue base and the god of the later temples. Egypt did not only build monuments, it built reputations, on a timescale nothing else has matched. By roughly 2,600 years before Christ, every piece is on the table. A unified country, a predictable river, a calendar, a measurement system, a literate administrative class, a theology that makes governing the same thing as holding back chaos. And now, proof that stone can be raised into the sky. A single family was about to take all of it and push it to the limit of what the machine could carry. Chapter 3. The Age of Stone. Ask anyone what they know about the pyramids, and you will usually get the same picture within a sentence or two. Masses of enslaved people. Whips. Men dying under blocks. That picture is not supported by the evidence, and clearing it away changes what you see for the rest of this chapter. In the 1990s, excavation on the plateau southeast of the pyramids, led by the Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and the American archaeologist Mark Lehner, uncovered a settlement associated with the builders, along with cemeteries where those workers were buried. Start with the burials. These are not the graves we would expect from the popular image of disposable prisoners worked to death. The workers were interred with grave goods, with inscriptions naming them and giving their job titles, and in some cases in small mud brick tombs of their own. They and their families made a claim on eternity, and the state did not object. Then, the bones. Remains from these cemeteries show heavy physical stress, degenerative joint damage, and a significant number of fractures. That is expected, but many of those fractures are healed, and some show signs of having been set. There are cases of surgical intervention, including amputations, where the individual survived long enough for the bone to remodel. Somebody was treating injured construction workers and keeping them alive afterward. Then the food. The settlement produced enormous quantities of animal bone, including cattle, sheep and goat, in numbers implying regular meat consumption. Alongside it, bakeries at industrial scale with bread molds recovered in the thousands, and evidence of large-scale brewing. Bread and beer were the wage. The workforce was being fed well by the standards of the time, which it had to be, because you do not move that much rock on a starvation diet. So who were they? The picture that emerges is a permanent core of skilled craftsmen, quarrymen, masons and supervisors, supported by a much larger, rotating labor force drawn from villages across Egypt and organized into named gangs. Some of the gang names survive, painted onto blocks in places the finished surface was meant to hide. The Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure. Those names reveal organized crews with identities of their own, not an anonymous mass. We should be precise about what this does and does not establish. It does not prove that no enslaved person ever worked on the plateau, and rations do not settle questions of legal status. The best reading is that much of this labor was an obligation owed to the state, rather than a wage contract in any modern sense. An expectation of service, rather than a free choice to walk away. That is not freedom as we understand it, and it should not be dressed up as a construction holiday. But it is categorically different from the chained masses of popular imagination. And the difference is the point of this chapter. These monuments were built by a state that could ask an enormous amount of its own people and be obeyed. And that state did not start at Giza, around 2,600 years before Christ. A king named Sneferu founded what we call the Fourth Dynasty. He reigned a long time, and by sheer volume of stone moved, he was the most ambitious builder in Egyptian history, more ambitious than his own son. Sneferu built 3 major pyramids, and the sequence of them preserves something no other reign gives us: a method being invented in public, with the mistakes left in. The first is at Midam. It appears to have begun as a stepped structure, and to have been modified toward a true, smooth-sided pyramid by filling in the steps. Today it stands as a strange tower rising out of an enormous skirt of rubble. There is real debate about when that collapse happened, whether during construction or long afterward, and we do not have it nailed down. What is not in doubt is that the design there was pushed past what the method could reliably support. The second is at Dahshur, and it is the most eloquent building in Egypt. It is called the Bent Pyramid, and the name is literal. It rises at roughly 54 degrees, for about half its height, and then, abruptly, the angle drops to about 43 degrees for the rest of the way to the top. Something went wrong partway up. The steep angle was loading the structure faster than the design could take, and there is internal cracking and evidence of settling that supports this. Rather than abandon the monument, the builders reduced the slope, and they finished it. The bent pyramid was completed, and it functioned. It simply carries, permanently and visibly, the record of a correction made under pressure. This was a culture that believed the king's tomb secured order itself, and it published its own structural trouble in limestone. Forever. Because finishing mattered more than pretending the work had gone smoothly. Then they walked a short distance north and built the third one, the Red Pyramid at Dahshur, named for the color of its stone, is a true pyramid, smooth-sided, built at the safer angle from the ground up, and it is the earliest large true pyramid we know of that was designed and completed that way. One structure pushed past its limits, one emergency correction carried through to completion, one clean success, inside a single reign. That sequence answers almost every mystery claim made about this subject. The Egyptians did not receive pyramid technology from anywhere. They ran into serious structural problems and changed the design as they learned. His son inherited a method that worked. Khufu came to the throne around 2,580 years before Christ and moved the royal necropolis north to the plateau at Giza. The Great Pyramid contains an estimated 2.33 million blocks. It stood originally around 481 feet tall, and it remained the tallest structure built by human beings for nearly 4,000 years, until cathedral spires in medieval Europe finally passed it. The base is level to within a couple of inches across more than 13 acres. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions to within a small fraction of a degree. That precision attracts the strangest explanations. So let us be specific about how it was achieved. Because it is knowable. Leveling can be done with water channels cut into the bedrock, or with sighting instruments and simple geometry. Alignment to true north can be done by observing the stars. And there is a well-developed body of scholarship arguing for methods using circumpolar stars, which would also help explain small progressive shifts in alignment between pyramids built at different dates. None of this is exotic. It requires patience, repetition, and a workforce disciplined enough to follow instructions exactly. The organizing intelligence has a name. A large mastaba tomb at Giza belongs to a man called Hemiunu, generally understood to have been a relative of Khufu, who held titles, placing him among the senior officials responsible for the king's works. A seated statue of him from that tomb, now in a museum in Germany, shows a heavy-set man in middle age. Whether he was the architect in our sense, or the administrator who commanded the architects, is a distinction the Egyptian titles do not draw cleanly. And then there is the document. In 2013, a French archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet, working at a site called Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, found rolls and fragments of papyrus in storage galleries near an ancient harbour. They are the oldest inscribed papyri yet found in Egypt. Among them is a work journal kept by a middle-ranking official named Mera, who supervised a team of about 40 men. Mera hauled limestone. His journal records, in short-dated entries, the daily movements of his crew, loading blocks at the quarries at Tura on the east bank, taking the boats across and up canals to Giza, delivering the stone, going back. It was written in the 27th year of Khufu's reign, which places it during the construction of the Great Pyramid itself. We have the shift log of a man who worked on the Great Pyramid. It is not mystical. It reads like transport paperwork, because that is what it is, and that is exactly why it matters. It confirms the fine limestone casing came from Tura by water. It confirms a system of canals and basins, bringing boats close to the plateau. It shows a crew as a named unit with a supervisor keeping records that somebody upstream expected to receive. Everything from the last chapter. The scribes, the papyrus, the rations, the standard measures, is sitting there in Mira's handwriting, doing the job it was invented for. Khufu's successors continued on the plateau. Khafre built the second pyramid, slightly smaller, but placed on higher ground so that it appears taller, which is either a coincidence of geology or a very Egyptian solution to being second. His complex includes the Great Sphinx, carved from the living bedrock in a quarry, with a lion body and a human head, generally interpreted as royal. The dating of the Sphinx has attracted more speculative argument than almost any object in the world. The mainstream position ties it to Khafre on the basis of its placement within his causeway and valley temple arrangement and the character of the associated stonework. Alternative early datings exist and have not persuaded the field. Menkaure built the third and much smaller pyramid. That reduction in scale is the beginning of the end of this era. Because here is what rarely gets said about the Age of Stone. It was brief. Monumental pyramid building at this scale lasts roughly a century. After Menkaure, royal pyramids get smaller and construction quality declines. Later, Egyptian pyramids often use rubble cores with limestone facings. And when the facing is stripped away by later builders, the core slumps into a heap. Many of them are heaps today. Egypt did not simply forget how. The state's resources, its priorities, and its political structure had all changed. And the stone changed with them. Treat these monuments as a reading on an instrument, and they become far more informative than they are as wonders. When the reading is high, you get the Great Pyramid. When it falls, you get rubble cores and shrinking tombs. Within a few centuries, provincial officials would be recording in their own tomb inscriptions that they fed their districts when nobody else could. In Mira's lifetime, that boast would have been unthinkable. Chapter 4. The First Collapse. Carved into the wall of a tomb at a place called Mu'alla, in southern Egypt, a governor named Ankhtifi left a sentence he wanted the future to read. He says that all of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, to the point that people were eating their own children, and he says that he did not let it happen in his districts. He fed his people. He gave grain to those who had none. He kept the towns under his authority alive, while the country around him starved. That inscription matters, and not only for what it describes. It matters because of who is speaking. Ankhtifi was not a king. He was a provincial official, standing in his own tomb, taking personal credit for keeping a region alive. 2 centuries earlier, that boast would have been close to treason. Feeding Egypt was the king's function. It was the entire justification for his existence. A local governor announcing that he personally kept the population fed is announcing that somebody else did not. Before we go further, a warning about the evidence, because this period attracts more overstatement than any other in Egyptian history. There is a famous papyrus, usually called the Admonitions of Ipuwer, that describes Egypt turned upside down. The river is blood. Servants wear the jewels of the wealthy. The poor take the property of the rich. It is vivid and horrifying, and it was for a long time quoted as an eyewitness account of the collapse we are about to describe. It probably is not. The surviving copy dates from centuries after the events, and most Egyptologists now read it as literature rather than reportage. Part of a genre in which chaos is described in order to argue for the necessity of strong kingship. And that same caution has to be turned on Ankhtifi, which is uncomfortable, because his inscription is the most quotable text of the period. He is advertising himself inside his own tomb. Real hardship in these decades is plausible and supported by more than literary memory. But the cannibalism and the regional scale are the claims of a provincial ruler selling his own success, not an independent report. Something bad happened. Ankhtifi is not a neutral witness to how bad. The harder evidence starts with a king who simply would not die. Pepi II came to the throne as a child, around 2,278 years before Christ, by the conventional dating, and Egyptian tradition credits him with a reign of 94 years. Modern scholars argue about that figure, and some prefer a number in the 60s, which is still extraordinary. Either way, he outlived his heirs, his officials, and quite possibly the usefulness of his own government. A very long reign looks like stability. It can be the opposite. A king who reigns for most of a century is a king whose energy declines while the machinery around him hardens. Successors age out. Factions settle in. Nobody at court has practiced the transfer of power, because no living person has seen one. Meanwhile, something structural had been happening in the provinces for generations, and the kings had allowed it. Egypt was administered through districts, which Egyptologists call nomes, using the later Greek term. Each had a governor. In the early centuries of the Old Kingdom, these officials were appointed from the center, served the crown, and were generally buried near the king in the great cemeteries at the capital. Then that changed. Provincial governors began building large decorated tombs in their own districts, at home, among their own people, and describing their offices as passing from father to son. That shift in burial location is one of the quietest revealing facts in Egyptian archaeology. An official who chooses to spend eternity beside the king is a servant of the crown. An official who chooses to spend eternity in his own province, surrounded by inscriptions, naming his own family, has become a local power with a local base. Kings had encouraged this, granting land, offices and tax exemptions to loyal men and to temple estates was a normal way of buying support. Every grant looked reasonable on the day it was made. Cumulatively, across 2 centuries, the crown gave away the revenue that made it the crown. Then the climate turned, around 4,200 years before the present, which is roughly 2,200 years before Christ. A significant dry event affected large parts of the northern hemisphere. Evidence comes from lake sediments, cave deposits, marine cores and pollen records across the Near East and North Africa, and it lines up with severe disruption in several early civilizations at roughly the same time, including the collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia. For Egypt, drying meant low Nile floods. Low floods meant less land watered and less grain. In a country whose entire political structure rested on the reliable annual arrival of a specific quantity of water, the causal chain here is a live scholarly debate. Some researchers weight the climate event heavily. Others argue the administrative decay was already terminal, and the drought only revealed it. The most plausible reading is that the two interacted, because a state already leaking authority to its provinces is exactly the kind of state that cannot absorb an environmental shock. What followed is called the First Intermediate Period, the roughly 130 years when Egypt was not a single functioning kingdom. The king lists from this period are a mess, and the mess is itself the evidence. They record large numbers of rulers with very short reigns. One tradition, preserved through Manetho and therefore written down long afterward, speaks of 70 kings in 70 days. That is not a count. It is a later summary of a situation nobody could reconstruct. And as a summary, it is excellent. Real power moved to the provinces. Governors like Ankhtifi ran their districts as functioning small states, raised troops, made war on their neighbors, and dealt with each other as equals. Ankhtifi's inscription is not only about famine. He also describes campaigns against other Egyptian districts. Egyptians were fighting Egyptians, and the winners were writing it on their walls with pride. Eventually, the fragments consolidated into two centers. In the north, a dynasty ruled from a city the Greeks later called Heracleopolis, controlling the delta and the entrance to the valley. In the south, a family based at Thebes. Then, a modest provincial town of no great history pulled the southern nomes together. Between them lay a contested zone, and the border moved back and forth for generations. No, here is where the standard telling misleads people. The first intermediate period is usually presented as a dark age. Later, Egyptian writers certainly presented it that way, because later Egyptian writers worked for kings with an interest in the idea that division equals catastrophe. Look at what the archaeology shows instead. Provincial art flourishes. Regional styles appear that are cruder by the standard of the royal workshops and far more varied and inventive. More people are getting decorated burials than before, not fewer. Coffins, funerary equipment, and inscribed objects appear in the graves of people well below the elite of the Old Kingdom. Craftsmen who had worked for the central court dispersed into the provinces and took their skills with them. As royal workshops and central patronage weakened, skills and resources became far more visible outside the capital than they had been. That is not an argument that collapse was good. People suffered, and there is supporting evidence for real hardship beyond Anktiphes' self-promotion. It is an argument against the instinct to assume that a strong central state and a thriving society are the same thing. Egypt in this period was poorer at the top and, in certain measurable ways, broader at the bottom. There is one more consequence, and it is the deepest. The Old Kingdom operated on an idea. The king upheld Ma'at. He was the link between the human world and the divine. The reason the flood came and the crops grew, that idea had been carved into every monument for 800 years. Then the floods failed and the kings could not fix it. We cannot get inside the heads of a population 5,000 years dead. What we can read is how the next set of kings chose to describe themselves. And the change is unmistakable. Egyptian kingship survived, and it was rebuilt, and it lasted another 2,000 years. But the rulers who rebuilt it argued for themselves in a way their predecessors had never needed to. They described themselves as shepherds and providers, rather than as the natural order of things. Somebody had decided that the case now had to be made. If the king could no longer guarantee eternity, then somebody else was going to have to. Chapter 5. Rebuilt and changed. In the ruins of a town beside the pyramid of a king named Senusret II, at a site now called Lahun, excavators recovered something that almost never survives from the ancient world. Not royal annals, household paperwork. Among the Lahun papyri are documents recording the members of individual households. They list a man, his wife, his dependents, sometimes his mother, sometimes his sisters, sometimes servants, and they are updated over time as people are born, marry, move, and die. There are also wills, letters, temple duty rosters, accounts, and medical texts, including one of the earliest known gynecological papyri. The town itself was laid out on a grid, with a walled quarter of large houses and a much denser quarter of small ones. You can walk the plan on paper and see class divided by a wall. That is what the Middle Kingdom looks like from the ground. A functioning country with a census, a filing system, and a housing hierarchy. Getting there took a war. Reunification came from the south. Driven by the Theban family, we left consolidating power at the end of the last chapter, and specifically by a king named Mentuhotep II, whose reign is conventionally dated to the middle of the 21st century before Christ and lasted around 50 years. We have rare physical evidence of the cost. In a tomb near his funerary complex at Deir el-Bahari, excavators found the bodies of roughly 60 men, buried together with honor, and the injuries are unmistakable. Arrow wounds, crushing blows to the skull, wounds consistent with men attacking a fortified position from below and being struck from above. They were soldiers. They died violently, and the king thought them important enough to bury near himself. Reunification was not negotiated. It was taken. Mentuhotep then built his funerary monument at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank, at Thebes. And it is not a pyramid. It is a terraced structure set into the cliff, with colonnades, ramps, and a forest of columns. A design without real precedent. 600 years later, a queen we will meet shortly built her own famous temple immediately beside it, deliberately echoing this one. The new dynasty was not going to pretend the collapse had not happened by copying the architecture of the kings who failed. The following dynasty, the 12th, is where recovery becomes a system. It was founded around 1991 years before Christ by a man named Amenemhat I, who was very likely a senior official under the last Theban king rather than a member of the royal family. A career administrator took the throne, and he governed like one. He moved the capital, leaving Thebes and founding a new royal city near the entrance to the Fayum region, at the junction of Upper and Lower Egypt. Its name is usually rendered Ichtawi, meaning something close to Caesar of the two lands. The site has not been securely located and excavated, which is one of the great outstanding problems of Egyptian archaeology. But the logic is transparent. Thebes had won the war. Thebes was in the far south. A king who intends to hold the whole country does not govern it from one end. He also appears to have installed his son as co-ruler during his own lifetime. Co-regency in this period is debated, and the evidence is not as clean as older accounts suggest. But the practical problem it addresses is real. The moment of transfer had destroyed the old kingdom. An heir who is already crowned and already known to the officials and the army turns the death of a king from a crisis into an event. Something did go wrong at the end of that reign. Two literary texts circle it. One, usually called the Instruction of Amenemhat, is written as the dead king speaking to his son, warning him to trust no one and describing an attack in the night by men of his own household. The other, the story of Sinuhe, opens with an official on campaign, hearing the news of the king's death and fleeing the country in terror. Both are literary compositions, probably produced under the successor. The tradition strongly implies a violent death inside the palace, and the event cannot be independently reconstructed. What we can say is that a new government does not compose texts explaining a night in the palace unless something happened that required explaining. Sinuhe deserves a moment on its own, because it is the finest thing Egypt wrote, and it shows what this civilization had learned. An Egyptian official flees to the lands east of Egypt. He prospers there, marries, raises a family, becomes a chief among the people who took him in, and defeats a challenger in single combat. He has a good life, and it is not enough. What consumes him is the fear of dying and being buried abroad, without the proper rites. In the end, the king invites him home, and the emotional climax of the story is not the reunion or the restored office. It is his tomb. An Old Kingdom text would not have needed to make that argument. Sinuhe is a story about a man who has to lose Egypt in order to explain why Egypt is worth having. Written by people whose grandparents had watched the whole arrangement fall apart. Which brings us to the most consequential change of the era. And it is not architectural or military. It is a change in who gets to be immortal. And to understand it, you need to know what Egyptians believed happened when they died. They believed a person was made of several distinct components: the body, the name, the shadow, and two things usually left untranslated: the Ka and the Ba. The Ka is something like the life force, which survived death but had to be sustained by offerings. The Ba is closer to personality, the part that could move, that could leave the tomb and return to it. Survival meant keeping all of these intact and connected, which is why the body had to be preserved, why the name had to be spoken and written, and why tombs were provisioned with food. Preserving the body is where mummification comes in, and it became an industry. The process took around 70 days in its developed form. The internal organs were removed, treated separately, and stored, though practice varied considerably by period. The body was packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt gathered from desert lakes, which drew out the moisture. It was then cleaned, treated with oils and resins, and wrapped in linen, with protective amulets placed between the layers, and it came in price tiers. Herodotus, writing much later and reporting what Egyptians told him, describes 3 grades of service at different costs, and while his details need caution, the underlying picture of a commercial trade with options is consistent with the archaeological evidence. The finest work went to those who could pay for it. Most Egyptians got something far simpler, and the poorest got burial in the dry sand, which preserved bodies perfectly well and had been doing so since before anybody invented a technique. Now, the destination, and this is where Ma'at returns. The Egyptian afterlife was not automatic. It had to be passed. In the version most people picture, the dead person is brought before a tribunal, and the heart, which Egyptians understood as the seat of thought and character, is placed on a scale. On the other pan sits the feather of Ma'at. The dead had to declare their innocence of a long list of offenses. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied on the scales. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. The god Thoth recorded the result. If the heart balanced against the feather, the person passed into the afterlife. If it did not, a creature waiting beside the scale devoured it, and the person simply ceased. A note on when. That full judgment scene, with the scale and the feather and the declarations, is best known from the funerary texts of the New Kingdom, and later, the collections usually called the Book of the Dead. It is not a Middle Kingdom picture, and we should not project the finished image backward. What is taking shape in the period we are in now is the logic underneath it. Ma'at as the standard, Osiris as the ruler of the dead, and, crucially, the idea that an ordinary person could be measured against that standard at all. Because in the Old Kingdom, the great funerary spells were royal. The pyramid texts, carved inside the burial chambers of kings from the late 5th dynasty onward, were for the king. His eternity was a function of his office, and everyone else's was at best attached to his. In the Middle Kingdom, versions of those spells start appearing, painted on the inside of wooden coffins belonging to officials, provincial administrators, and people outside the royal family entirely. Egyptologists call this material the coffin texts. The spells are adapted, expanded and rearranged, and the person they promise to protect is no longer necessarily a king. At the same time, the god Osiris rises to a central position. Osiris was killed by his brother, mourned and restored by his wife Isis, and made ruler of the dead. And the promise attached to him is that the deceased can be identified with him, not serve him, become like him. The city of Abydos, associated with his cult, became a destination, and Egyptians who could afford it set up memorial stones there, so they would have a permanent presence at the god's festival, even if they were buried elsewhere. This is usually called the democratization of the afterlife, and the phrase is useful as long as we are honest about its limits. It was not democracy in any sense we would recognize, and it did not begin from the bottom of society. It spread gradually through elite funerary culture and established religious practice. And access still cost money. A painted coffin, astela at abydos, a properly equipped burial, all of it required resources most Egyptians did not have. What changed is that eternity stopped being an attribute of one office and became something a person could prepare for, purchase, and personally secure. Notice when that change happens. Immediately after the century in which the king demonstrably failed to guarantee anything, the rest of the dynasty is a study in hard-edged government. The kings expanded into the Fayum with major irrigation and land reclamation. They pushed south into Nubia and held it with a chain of enormous mud brick fortresses along the river at the Second Cataract, at sites called Buhen and Semna and others, with walls, ditches, projecting towers and internal barracks. These were not trading posts. They were border control. And inscriptions record that Nubians could come north to trade only under supervision and were not to pass beyond a fixed point. Senusret III, in the 19th century before Christ, campaigned repeatedly in Nubia and reorganized the internal administration into large regional departments, answering to the capital. The great decorated provincial tombs largely stop after his reign, which is usually read as the center winning its long argument with the provinces. His statues are also the strangest royal portraits in Egyptian art, where Old Kingdom kings are serene and ageless. Senusret III is shown with heavy-lidded eyes, deep lines running from the nose, drawn cheeks, and an expression that has been described as careworn and brooding. Whether this is realistic portraiture or a deliberate argument that kingship is a burden rather than a state of divine ease is debated, and both readings may be working at once. It is a face that would have been unthinkable at Giza. The dynasty ended with a succession problem. Among the last rulers is a woman, Sobekneferu, who reigned in her own right for a few years, around 1780 years before Christ. Her monuments show her using royal titles, and in some depictions she combines female dress with elements of male royal costume, which is the first surviving attempt to solve a problem that returns in a far more famous form later in this story. The visual language of kingship had been built for a man. She left no successor of her line. In the eastern delta, meanwhile, a population of Levantine origin had been growing for generations. In towns where the pottery, the burial customs, the weapons and the names were not Egyptian, they had come as traders, workers, and settlers, and the Egyptian state had let them come. Chapter 6. The weapon that changed everything. A chariot wheel from ancient Egypt weighs almost nothing. That is the fact that surprises people. The vehicles recovered from Egyptian tombs, including several found with Tutankhamun, are built with an obsessive commitment to lightness. The wheels have 6 spokes of bent wood, each laminated from separate pieces and bound at the joints. The rim is assembled from curved sections and wrapped in rawhide applied wet, which shrank as it dried and pulled the whole wheel tight into a single tensioned object. The floor of the car is often woven leather mesh rather than solid boards, so it flexes over rough ground and carries less weight. A complete Egyptian chariot could be lifted by one man. Nothing in the Old Kingdom or the Middle Kingdom is remotely like this. The precision joinery, the lamination, the use of tension as a structural principle, the pairing with a trained horse. All of it reached Egypt from outside, and it arrived in this chapter. The usual version of what happened next is that Egypt was invaded by barbarians and eventually threw them out. The truth is more interesting and less flattering to Egyptian pride. Start with how they got in. Because nobody stormed the border. For generations, people from the Levant, the region covering roughly modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and southern Turkey, had been moving into the eastern delta. They came as traders, craftsmen, soldiers, and settlers. Egypt wanted what they brought: timber, copper, oil, wine, skilled labor. The delta was the natural place for them because it faced their world. The best evidence comes from a site in the eastern delta called Tel el Darba, excavated over decades by an Austrian team led by Manfred Bietak. What the excavation revealed is a city that changed character layer by layer. Egyptian-style buildings early on, then houses built on Levantine plans, then burials with weapons of Levantine type, and donkeys buried at tomb entrances, which is a Levantine custom and not an Egyptian one. Then temples on Near Eastern plans. Then Levantine pottery in quantity. Nobody invaded that city. It changed because the people living in it changed. Gradually, over a very long time, while the Egyptian government at Ichtawi grew steadily weaker. Around the middle of the 17th century before Christ, the rulers of that delta population stopped taking orders from anyone. They took Egyptian royal titles, wrote their names in Egyptian, and governed the north from Tel el Darba, which they called Avaris. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, filtered through Greek. That phrase became the word we use now. Hyksos, a word about that word, because it causes constant confusion. Hyksos is not the name of a people. It is a title for their kings. There was no Hyksos nation and no Hyksos homeland. Isotope analysis of teeth from burials at the site, published in 2020, indicated that a substantial number of individuals buried there had grown up outside Egypt, in a pattern consistent with long-term settlement rather than a sudden military influx. So this was not a single invasion. It grew out of generations of migration, settlement, and political fragmentation. How the final transfer of power actually happened remains poorly documented, and we should not fill that silence with a confident story in either direction. Egypt fractured into three. In the north, the Hyksos kings ruled the delta from Avaris and traded across the eastern Mediterranean. In the far south, beyond the First Cataract, the kingdom of Kush had grown into a serious power centered on the city of Kerma, with monumental architecture of its own and control of the trade routes into Africa. Squeezed between them, an Egyptian dynasty at Thebes held a shrinking territory and paid for the privilege. One document captures the humiliation exactly. It survives on a papyrus, copied centuries later, and it records a message sent from the Hyksos king Apepi to the Theban king Seqenenretau. In it, the northern king complains that the noise of the hippopotamuses in the pools at Thebes is keeping him awake, and demands that something be done about it. Thebes is around 400 miles from Avaris, whatever the literal truth of that letter, and it survives in a much later literary form. Its meaning is unmistakable. It is a provocation dressed as a complaint, and every Egyptian who heard it understood. We know how Seqenenretau died. His mummy was found in the 19th century in a cache of royal bodies at Deir el-Bahari, and the injuries to the skull are severe and unhealed. Multiple wounds, including damage consistent with an axe blade and with a dagger. A study published in 2021 using computed tomography scanning argued, on the basis of the position of the injuries and the state of his hands, that he may have been killed while restrained rather than in open combat. The interpretation is debated. The violence is not. His sons continued the war. Kamose left inscriptions describing his campaign north against Avaris, and they contain a striking passage in which he reports his own officials advising caution, telling him that the current arrangement is tolerable, that they still farm their land and hold their cattle, and that there is no need for this fight. Kamose records their advice in order to reject it. That is a remarkable thing to put on a monument. It admits that occupation was survivable, that many Egyptians had made their peace with it, and that the war of liberation was a choice made by a royal family rather than a national uprising. The job was finished by Kamose's brother, Ahmose I, around 50 years before Christ. Avaris fell. The Hyksos rulers were expelled, and Ahmose pursued them into southern Canaan, besieging a place called Sharuhen. He then turned south, broke the power of Kush, and pushed the Egyptian frontier deep into Nubia. For the first time in over 2 centuries, one man ruled from Nubia to the Mediterranean. Egyptologists mark that as the start of the new kingdom. Now look at what Egypt was carrying when it came out the other side: the horse and the chariot, which became the core of Egyptian military power, with a dedicated chariotry arm and its own officer class. The composite bow, built from wood, horn and sinew laminated together, far more powerful than a simple self-bow, bronze working at a level Egypt had not previously matched, including the khopesh, a curved slashing sword of Near Eastern origin that ends up in the hands of gods on temple walls. New musical instruments, the upright loom, new words absorbed into Egyptian from Semitic languages. Many of those technologies had entered Egypt through the same wider West Asian world from which the Hyksos rulers emerged. This was not a single gift from a single defeated enemy. It was Egypt being connected, sometimes unwillingly, to a network of exchange it had spent centuries holding at arm's length. Egypt did not survive this period by being stronger or purer than its rivals. Egypt survived by losing, watching closely, and taking everything worth taking. There was one further consequence, and it lasted 500 years. Egypt had gone beyond its borders before. Old and Middle Kingdom rulers campaigned in Nubia, built fortresses there, worked mines in the eastern desert and Sinai, and sent expeditions and trade missions into the Levant. What they had not maintained was a deep, permanent imperial system in Western Asia. Their frontier policy east of the Delta was managed, occasional, and essentially about keeping trouble at a distance. After Avaris, that changed. The lesson the new dynasty drew was that the Delta had been lost because a rival power had been allowed to grow just outside the border and then walk in. So they moved the border. For the next several centuries, Egyptian kings campaigned in Canaan and Syria as routine, garrisoned foreign towns, took the sons of foreign princes to be raised at the Egyptian court, and treated the eastern Mediterranean seaboard as a buffer zone to be managed. Egypt stopped being a kingdom with interests abroad and became an empire, and it did so because it had been badly frightened. Chapter 7. Empire. At a temple on the west bank at Thebes, on a wall built for a ruler who governed as king. There are places where the figure has been chiseled out of the stone, not defaced randomly, removed with care. The surrounding scene is often intact. The offerings, the gods receiving them, the accompanying text, all still there. Only the ruler is gone, cut back to a blank patch shaped like the person who used to stand in it. In some cases, her name was replaced with the name of a different king. In others, it was simply erased and nothing was put back. The woman removed from those walls was Hatshepsut, and she was one of the most successful rulers Egypt produced for most of the last century. The erasure was explained as revenge. Her stepson, Thutmose III, kept from power during her reign, took the throne on her death and set about destroying her memory in a fury of resentment. It is a satisfying story. It does not fit the evidence. The chronology is the problem. Analysis of the erasures indicates that the removal of her images and names did not begin immediately after her death. The best current estimates place the campaign around 20 years into Thutmose III's independent reign, and possibly later. 20 years is not the timeline of a man acting on rage. And the erasure was selective, where she appeared as queen, wife and daughter. She was often left alone. What was removed was Hatshepsut as king. That points toward a dynastic problem rather than a personal one. Thutmose III had a son to install as heir, and behind him a line to secure. A female king in the official record is a precedent, and a precedent is a claim somebody else can use later. The most persuasive reading available is that this was housekeeping of the record, done coldly, decades after the fact. We cannot read anyone's motives across 3,500 years, and this remains debated. What we can say is that the simple revenge story is not supported by the dating, and that it has survived mainly because it is a better anecdote than the truth. So, let us restore what was taken off the walls. Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I and the principal wife of her half-brother, Thutmose II. When he died, the heir was a young boy, the son of a secondary wife, and Hatshepsut governed as regent. That was not unusual. Egypt had seen royal women hold power on behalf of children before. What was unusual is that after about 7 years, she stopped calling herself regent and took the full titles of a king. That required solving a presentation problem, because the entire visual and verbal apparatus of Egyptian kingship had been built over 1,600 years for a man. Her solution was thorough and unsentimental. In official art, she is increasingly shown in male royal costume, with the kilt, the headcloth, and the ceremonial false beard that every king wore. In texts, the grammar shifts, sometimes feminine, sometimes masculine, occasionally within the same inscription. She was not pretending to be a man and made no attempt to conceal her sex. She was wearing the uniform of the office, and modern retellings almost always get that distinction wrong. She also built an argument into stone, at her temple at Deir el-Bahari, immediately beside the older terraced monument of Mentuhotep II. She had reliefs carved showing her divine conception, in which the god Amun takes the form of her father, and her presentation to the gods as the intended ruler. She also recorded that her father had named her successor during his lifetime, which no independent source confirms. That is state propaganda. It is also precisely the kind of propaganda male kings had been producing since the Narmer Palette, and it should be judged by that standard rather than a stricter one. Her reign was prosperous and, by the standards of this dynasty, remarkably peaceful. There were military actions, including campaigns in Nubia, but she did not spend her 20-odd years on the throne in the field. She spent them building and trading. The signature achievement is the expedition to Punt, recorded in detail on the walls at Deir el-Bahari. Punt was a land Egypt traded with somewhere to the south and east, most likely on the African coast of the Red Sea or in the Horn of Africa region, though its exact location is still argued over. The reliefs show the ships, the loading, the Punt village with houses raised on stilts, the ruler of Punt and his wife, and above all, the cargo, encens, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and living myrrh trees carried home in baskets to be planted in the temple grounds. She recorded a trade mission with the prominence other kings gave to battles. That is a statement about what she considered worth eternity. She was also served by an official named Senenmut, who held many titles including tutor to her daughter, and who was permitted a burial of extraordinary quality for a man of his origins. There has been endless speculation about the nature of their relationship. And there is no evidence for any of it. What the evidence shows is a ruler who elevated a talented administrator very far and very fast, which is a thing successful rulers do. When Hatshepsut died, around 1458 years before Christ, Thutmose III took sole power, and the man described for a century as her frustrated victim turned out to be, by almost any measure you choose, the most effective military commander Egypt ever put in the field. His first campaign is among the best documented battles in the ancient world before the Greeks, because he had the whole account carved at Karnak, based on a daily journal kept on leather by the army scribes. A coalition of Canaanite and Syrian rulers had gathered at Megiddo, a fortress town controlling a critical route through the hills of northern Canaan. Thutmose marched north, at a place called Yehem. His officers advised taking one of two safe wide roads to approach the town, and warned against the third option, a pass so narrow the army would have to move through it in single file, horse behind horse and man behind man. He took the narrow pass. The Karnak account preserves his reasoning, and whether or not those are his words, the logic is sound. The enemy would expect the safe roads and would be waiting on them. He emerged onto the plain in front of Megiddo with his army intact and the coalition out of position. His forces broke the enemy line, and the defeated troops fled toward the town. And here the record does something royal inscriptions are not supposed to do. It admits a mistake. The Egyptian army stopped to loot the abandoned enemy camp, which let the enemy leadership escape into the fortress, where the people inside pulled them up over the walls with knotted clothing. What could have been a single day's victory became a siege of about 7 months. Megiddo fell, and the campaign established a pattern. Thutmose III repeated across at least 17 campaigns over 20 years. He did not simply raid and withdraw. He installed garrisons, took hostages from the ruling families of defeated cities, and brought their sons to Egypt to be educated at court, so that when those young men eventually inherited their thrones, they would be culturally Egyptian and personally connected to the Egyptian king. That is a sophisticated method. It is cheaper than permanent occupation and considerably more durable. Under him and his successors, Egypt reached its greatest extent, controlling territory from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the Euphrates region in northern Syria. Tribute flowed in from vassal states, gold from the Nubian mines, timber from the Lebanese coast, and the temples of Amun at Karnak grew richer with every campaign, because the king credited the god with the victories and paid him accordingly. Every conquest enlarged the estates, granarias, herds and workforce controlled by the priesthood of Amun at Thebes. Every victory made the temple a larger economic institution over several generations. The god who guaranteed the king's wars became one of the wealthiest landholders in the country, with its own bureaucracy, its own revenues, and a permanent interest in the arrangement continuing. Egypt had built a rival power inside itself, and it had done so out of gratitude. Chapter 8. The king who tried to delete the gods. Picture a sun disk with rays coming down from it, and every ray ending in a small human hand. Some of the hands hold a sign to the nostrils of the people below, and the people below are always the same people. A king, his wife, their daughters. Nobody else in Egypt is reached by those hands. That image is the entire theology of this chapter, and it is worth reading slowly, because everything strange about the reign it belongs to is already visible in it. There is no statue to consult, no sacred animal, no shrine that only a priest may enter, no god who speaks through an oracle. There is a light in the sky that touches the royal family directly, and access to it runs through them. The king who commissioned that image came to the throne around 1353 years before Christ as Amenhotep IV. In the 5th year of his reign, he changed his name to Akhenaten. Hold in mind where the last chapter left off. The temple of Amun at Karnak had spent 200 years absorbing the profits of empire. It held vast estates, herds, workshops, granarias, ships, and personnel. And its high priest was one of the most powerful men in Egypt. The king was still king, but he shared the country with an institution that had its own income and did not depend on him for it. The Aten itself was not new. The visible disk of the sun had existed in Egyptian religion for centuries as one aspect of the solar divine. What was new was the exclusivity. Some cults, above all that of Amun, were actively suppressed. Temple revenues were redirected. Agents were sent out with chisels to remove the name of Amun from monuments, including, in some cases, from the name of his own father, Amenhotep III. Even the plural word for gods was attacked in inscriptions. How complete this was across the whole country is not clear, and we should not imagine every shrine in Egypt bolted shut on a single day. But the direction was unmistakable, and it ran against the grain of how ancient religion normally worked. Ancient polytheistic systems were usually additive. New gods more often joined an existing divine world than replaced it. Conquered peoples kept their deities. What Akhenaten attempted ran the other way, backed by state power, against the religious practice of an entire country. Whether that amounts to monotheism, in the sense later religions use the word, is argued over and probably unanswerable, since Akhenaten himself remained divine, and worship in practice ran through him. Then he built a city. Around the 6th year of his reign, he chose an empty stretch of desert on the east bank, about halfway between Memphis and Thebes, where no town had stood and no god had a claim. He marked the boundaries with enormous inscribed stelae cut into the cliffs, recording an oath that the city would be built there and only there. He named it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. The modern name for the site is Amarna. He built it fast, in mud, brick, and because it was occupied for barely 20 years, and then abandoned, and never overbuilt, Amarna gives us the best preserved plan of an ancient Egyptian city we have. Excavation there, carried out over more than a century, and continuing under the direction of Barry Kemp, has produced a picture of daily life more detailed than for any other Egyptian settlement. That picture complicates the romance considerably. The great houses of officials are spacious, with gardens, wells, and their own granaries, around and between them. The housing of the workers is dense and small. Analysis of skeletal remains from the cemeteries used by the ordinary population has indicated widespread nutritional stress, injuries consistent with heavy labor, spinal damage, and a striking proportion of individuals who died young. The bodies suggest a population working extremely hard on inadequate food. Hard labor and short lives were the ordinary condition of ancient populations everywhere, and it would be unfair to treat this as unique to Akhenaten. But it is a necessary corrective to the version of this king that circulates today, in which he appears as a visionary humanitarian ahead of his time. The ground does not support that portrait. The city also held an archive, and the archive is how we know what the rest of the world was saying to Egypt at the time. In 1887, a woman digging for fertilizer in the ruins turned up small clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks. They were sold, scattered, and for a while dismissed as forgeries, because nobody expected Mesopotamian cuneiform in the middle of Egypt. They were not forgeries. Around 380 of them survive today in museums in Berlin, London, and Cairo, and Egyptologists call them the Amarna letters. They are diplomatic mail, written not in Egyptian, but in Akkadian. the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East. Egypt was powerful enough to demand tribute and not powerful enough to make everyone write in Egyptian. The tone is what stays with you. Kings of Babylon. Assyria and Mitanni address the Egyptian king as an equal and complain about gifts. One writes at length about gold, saying that what arrived was less than promised and of poor quality, and reminding the Egyptian king that in his own country, gold is as common as dust. Then there are the letters from vassals in Canaan, and they read very differently. City rulers report attacks by their neighbors, accuse each other of treason, and beg for troops. Sometimes for as few as 50 men. One ruler in the hills writes repeatedly and with rising desperation that his territory is being lost. Whether Egypt answered, and how often, we cannot say. Nobody kept the outgoing file. The art from Amarna is genuinely strange. For 1600 years, Egyptian royal figures had been idealized, athletic and ageless. In the early Amarna style, the king is shown with an elongated skull, a long thin neck, a narrow face with heavy lips, a soft belly, wide hips and thin limbs. His daughters are shown with extended skulls. Bodies curve where they were once straight. Medical explanations have been proposed for decades, and none has been demonstrated. The soberest position is that this is a style rather than a portrait. It applies to the king, his family, and his officials alike. It appears exactly when the religion changed, and it fades as the period ends. A ruler rewriting the relationship between human and divine had every reason to be depicted as something not quite ordinary. Amarna also gave us one of the most reproduced objects in the world, the painted limestone bust of Nefertiti, chief wife of Akhenaten, was found in 1912 in the workshop of a sculptor named Thutmose, in a house at Amarna, by a German expedition led by Ludwig Borchardt. It is unfinished. One eye was never inlaid. It was a studio model rather than a monument, which is why it has an immediacy that finished royal sculpture almost never has. Nefertiti held an unusual position. She appears in scenes and poses normally reserved for kings, including striking enemies, and her name occurs in contexts suggesting authority rather than consort status. In the later years of the reign, a ruler appears under the name Neferuten, and there is serious scholarship arguing that this was Nefertiti ruling as co-king or successor. Other scholars identify that figure differently. The evidence is fragmentary, and the question is open. Then it ended, and it ended almost instantly. Akhenaten died around 1336 years before Christ, after roughly 17 years on the throne. After a brief and confused succession, the crown came to a boy of about 9, who began his reign as Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. Within a few years, the name was changed to Tutankhamen, living image of Amun. The court left Amarna. The temples of the old gods reopened. Their estates were restored. A stela set up under the young king, usually called the Restoration Stela, describes the country before his reign in blunt terms. The temples were ruined, the shrines overgrown, and when anyone prayed to a god, the god did not answer. That is the official verdict of the Egyptian state on Akhenaten's revolution, issued by the government that immediately followed it. His successors went further. His monuments were dismantled and the blocks reused as fill inside later buildings, which is why so much Amarna wall decoration survives in remarkably fresh condition. Tens of thousands of them. Small, standardized blocks Egyptologists call talatat have been recovered from inside the pylons at Karnak. His city was abandoned. Later king lists skip him and his immediate successors entirely, jumping from Amenhotep III to Horemheb as though the intervening decades had not happened. So why did it collapse so completely? Several things were pulling at once. The temple institutions had enormous economic interests in restoration. The succession was weak, and a child king needed powerful backers. A new regime needed legitimacy, and found it in the language of repair. And there is the manner of the thing. Egypt had changed its religion substantially before, as we saw when Osiris and the coffin texts transformed the afterlife. That change spread gradually through existing practice and funerary culture across generations. This one came from above, inside a single reign, and it disrupted the festivals that structured the year, attacked the god whose temples employed, and fed enormous numbers of people, and offered in exchange a deity approached through the king. We cannot know what most Egyptians believed. What we can measure is how fast it went, and it went in a single succession, in every direction, at once, with no faction anywhere in the country willing to defend it. Whatever the reform had become in the years it ran, it had not put down roots outside the court and the institutions the court paid for. There is a lesson in that, and it is one of the more useful things this story has to offer. Akhenaten had immense authority, enormous resources, and nearly 2 decades in which to impose the change. He could compel obedience while he lived. What he could not do was make the change outlast him. The boy king who presided over the restoration died at around 18 and was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, filled with grave goods, some of which appear to have been made for somebody else. His name was left off the king lists. His tomb entrance was buried under the debris of later construction. That accident is the reason a minor king of a difficult period became the most famous Egyptian who ever lived. His tomb was overlooked in antiquity and found nearly intact in 1922 by Howard Carter, working for George Herbert. Lord Carnarvon. The gold that came out of that small tomb is what the world now pictures when it thinks of ancient Egypt. It belonged to a teenager who ruled for about a decade in the aftermath of a failed revolution. If a king of that stature was buried with that much wealth, the burials of the great kings of this dynasty, all robbed in antiquity, are beyond reconstruction. Chapter 9. The Art of Being Remembered. On the walls at Abu Simbel, at Karnak, at Luxor, at the Ramesseum, in inscriptions repeated across Egypt. The same event appears in words and pictures. The king stands alone in his chariot. His army has fled or been cut off. Thousands of enemy chariots surround him. He calls on his god, charges into the mass of them, and breaks them single-handed, driving the enemy into a river where they drown. It is the most heavily publicized military engagement of the ancient world. Now the other set of facts. The battle took place near the city of Kadesh in Syria, around 1274 years before Christ. The enemy was the Hittite Empire. Afterward, the border between Egypt and the Hittites stayed roughly where it had been. Kadesh remained in the Hittite sphere. Egyptian influence in northern. We also have Hittite material, recovered from their capital in what is now Turkey, though not a full battle narrative to set beside the Egyptian one. What survives is diplomatic record, and it gives no support to Ramesses' claim of a decisive victory. Whatever happened tactically on that field, Ramesses failed to take Kadesh and failed to shift the strategic balance in Egypt's favor. He turned it into the defining triumph of his reign anyway, by a method so simple it is easy to miss. He wrote it down more times, in more places, at greater length than anyone had ever written down anything. That is why Ramesses matters far beyond his own achievements. He is the ancient world's clearest demonstration that the historical record is not a neutral thing that survives by accident. It is built, deliberately, by people with reasons. He was genuinely formidable, and we should say so first. He came to the throne around 1279 years before Christ and reigned for 67 years. He was probably in his 90s when he died. He outlived at least a dozen of his own sons. And the son who eventually succeeded him, Merneptah, was around 60 when he took the throne. He built more than any king in Egyptian history. He completed the enormous Hall of Columns at Karnak. He built his own memorial temple on the West Bank at Thebes. He founded a new capital in the eastern delta called Ramesses, near the old Hyksos city of Avaris, which put the government close to the frontier that mattered rather than 500 miles from it. And in Nubia he cut 2 temples directly into a cliff face at Abu Simbel, fronted by 4 seated statues of himself, around 65 feet high. The interior of the great temple at Abu Simbel is aligned so that on certain days of the year, the rising sun reaches down the length of the rock-cut hall and lights the statues in the sanctuary at the back. That is engineering carried out inside solid rock, with no possibility of correcting a mistake. He also had an enormous family. Estimates of his children run past 100, and while the exact number is uncertain, the tomb built for his sons in the Valley of the Kings, known as Tomb Number 5, contains well over 100 chambers and corridors, making it the largest tomb in the valley by a wide margin. It was cleared and studied from the 1980s onward by the American Egyptologist Kent Weeks and his team. So the man was not a fraud. He was a builder and an administrator of the first rank who ran a large empire competently for 2/3 of a century. What he understood better than anyone before him was that stone is a medium. Ramesses carved his name deeper than his predecessors, in incised relief that is far harder to erase than the shallow raised relief used earlier. He put his cartouche on buildings he did not build, including monuments of the Middle Kingdom. He reused older statues by recutting faces and replacing names. Later, Egyptians did the same to him, which is fair, but he did it at industrial scale. Multiply that by 67 years of continuous production and a wildly disproportionate share of all surviving Egyptian monumental inscription carries his name. When later Greek writers described a legendary Egyptian conqueror, they were partly describing him. When Egyptians of later centuries looked back at a golden age, they saw his monuments, because his monuments were the ones still standing and still legible. He did not just win the argument about his reign, he outproduced every alternative source. And yet the most valuable thing to come out of Kadesh is not the propaganda. It is what happened 16 years later. Around 1259 years before Christ, Egypt and the Hittite Empire concluded a formal treaty. We have it from both sides. An Egyptian version carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls at Karnak, and a Hittite version on clay tablets in Akkadian recovered from their capital. Having both versions of the same agreement, written by 2 governments who had been at war, is one of the rarest things in ancient history. The 2 texts match closely on substance, with each side arranging the framing to its own advantage. The terms are recognizably a peace treaty, an end to hostilities, mutual defense if either is attacked by a third party, a promise not to invade each other's territory, and provisions for the return of fugitives, including a clause specifying that those returned should not be punished with mutilation or harm to their families, which is a humanitarian provision in a document from 13 centuries before Christ. A reproduction of this treaty hangs at the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. It is often called the earliest surviving international peace agreement, and that needs a small qualification, because earlier treaties are known from Mesopotamia in fragmentary form. What makes this one exceptional is that we possess it from both parties, in both languages, in substantial completeness. The peace held. It was sealed later by the marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramesses, and there is evidence of continued correspondence and even of Egyptian grain shipments to the Hittites during a period of shortage. So the reign remembered for a battle that changed nothing, produced a treaty that changed a great deal. Ramesses celebrated the wrong thing, and we have been repeating his mistake for 3,000 years. His mummy survives, recovered from a cache at Deir el-Bahari, where priests had moved royal bodies for safekeeping in antiquity. Examination has shown an elderly man with severe arterial disease, extensive dental abscesses, and advanced arthritis, including curvature of the spine. In 1976, the body was flown to Paris for treatment against fungal deterioration and was received with the formalities normally given to a visiting head of state. His successor, Merneptah, faced attacks from Libyan groups and from seaborne raiders, and defeated them. On a granite stela recording that campaign, in a list of defeated peoples in Canaan, appears a name written in a form Egyptologists read as Israel. It is the earliest known mention of that name in any historical record, and it tells us only that a people so called existed in the region at that time, and that an Egyptian king claimed to have beaten them. Everything beyond that is inference. And there is a very large literature of inference attached to this single line. Merneptah's Libyan War and those seaborne raiders were not isolated incidents. In the year 1279 before Christ, Ramesses inherited a world of great powers, exchanging letters and gifts and daughters. Within a century of his death, most of those powers no longer existed. Chapter 10. The Bronze Age Falls. Ugarit was a wealthy port on the coast of what is now northern Syria. It had a palace with an archive of clay tablets, merchants trading with Cyprus and the Aegean and Mesopotamia, and a writing system that is among the earliest alphabets known. Around 1200 years before Christ, it burned and was never reoccupied. Tablets recovered from the destruction layers of that city include a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus. He reports that enemy ships have appeared, that towns have been burned, that his own forces are away in Hittite territory and his ships are away in Lycia, and that his country has been left undefended. He is describing an emergency in progress, and shortly afterward his city ceased to exist. Ugarit was not alone. Across the eastern Mediterranean, in the decades around 1200 years before Christ, a long list of major sites shows destruction layers or abandonment. The Hittite capital Hattusa was burned, and the Hittite Empire disappeared as a political entity. The Mycenaean palace centers in Greece collapsed, and with them went the writing system used to administer them, so that Greece entered several centuries without literacy. Cities across Cyprus, the Levant, and Anatolia fell. Historians call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and it is the closest thing to a general system failure in ancient history. An interconnected world of great kingdoms, exchanging the kind of letters we read in the Amarna archive, stopped functioning within about 2 generations. Egypt came through it. It was one of very few powers of that world to survive as a recognizable state. And even that survival needs qualifying, which is the work of this chapter. The Egyptian record centers on a set of enemies that Egyptian texts group together and that Egyptologists, following a 19th century French term, call the Sea Peoples. Merneptah fought some of them alongside Libyan allies in the late 13th century. A generation later, Ramesses III fought them again. In his 8th year, around 1178 years before Christ, and recorded the campaign in enormous detail on the walls of his memorial temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank at Thebes. Those reliefs are the richest visual source we have for the whole crisis. They show a land battle and a sea battle. In the sea battle, Egyptian ships engage enemy vessels in what appears to be the Nile mouths, with Egyptian archers shooting from decks and from shore. Enemy ships capsized and men in the water. The enemy warriors carry round shields and straight swords and wear distinctive headgear, some feathered or reed-like, some horned, Their ships have bird-head prows. The reliefs also show ox carts loaded with women and children. Those carts suggest that at least some of these groups were moving as communities rather than operating as conventional raiding forces. That is an inference rather than a proof. And armies have traveled with dependents in many periods. But combined with what was happening to settlements across the region, it fits a picture of populations in motion. Egyptian texts name several groups within the coalition, including names usually transliterated as Peleset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen and Weshesh. Attempts to match those names to known peoples have gone on for a century and a half. The identification of the Peleset with the group later known as the Philistines, who settled on the southern coast of Canaan, is the most widely accepted. Others rest on little more than similarity of sound. Here is the thing to hold on to, because this subject attracts confident storytelling that the evidence does not support. The Sea Peoples are not an explanation. They are a description of something Egypt saw arriving. For most of the 20th century, popular accounts treated them as the cause of the collapse, a mysterious horde that swept the Mediterranean and destroyed civilization. That model has largely broken down for a simple reason. If you ask what made these populations move in the first place, you are already asking about the collapse, which puts the Sea Peoples somewhere in the middle of the chain rather than at the start of it. What scholars increasingly describe instead is a compound failure, with several strands reinforcing each other. There is climate, sediment cores and pollen records from the region, including work on cores from Cyprus and the Levant, indicate significant drying in the decades around 1200 years before Christ. Drought here means crop failure, and crop failure in societies with thin margins means hunger and movement. There is the fragility of the trade system. Bronze requires copper and tin in particular traveled very long distances. A civilization whose weapons, tools, and prestige goods all depend on a long supply chain can be crippled by an interruption to that chain without anyone attacking it directly. There is the structure of these states. The Bronze Age palace kingdoms were centralized redistribution systems. Goods came into the palace and were allocated out from it. That is efficient, and it is brittle. When the palace burns, there is often no parallel network to keep the economy running, which helps explain why so many of these societies did not merely weaken, but disappeared as organized entities. There is earthquake activity, documented at some sites, though its role is debated and probably local rather than regional. And there is population movement, which is where the Sea Peoples belong, as a symptom that then becomes a cause. So why did Egypt hold? Not because its administration was more sophisticated than everyone else's. The Hittites had archives, taxation, officials, and a standing army. And we have just been reading a Ugaritic king's correspondence. What Egypt had was a different set of physical circumstances and a great deal of practice. Its food came from a river, fed by monsoon rains, 1,000 miles to the south. So a regional drought that ruined harvests in Anatolia. Greece and the Levant did not necessarily fail the Nile in the same years, though the Nile itself was never immune to variation, and Egypt did face food pressure in this period. Behind its frontier lay 700 miles of settled valley. So a defeat at the border was not the end of the country. And the apparatus that had to be mobilized to feed and armor defense had already survived 2 political fractures and been rebuilt both times by people who knew how it was done. So Ramesses III repelled the invasion, and Egypt entered the 12th century before Christ as the last great power of the Bronze Age world, still standing in a recognizable form. Now, for what the triumphal reliefs at Medinet Habu do not tell you. Later, in that same reign, the state failed to pay its own workers. The village of Deir el-Medina housed the craftsmen who cut and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They were skilled, many of them literate, and paid in rations of grain and other goods. In the 29th year of Ramesses III, the rations were late. We know what happened next because a scribe wrote it down as it unfolded. In a journal now usually called the Turin Strike Papyrus, the men counted the days, 18 into the month, and nothing had come. They walked off the site, went down past the guard posts, and sat down at the mortuary temples of earlier kings, which was the last place in the district anyone wanted a crowd of angry men. Officials came out to talk to them. The men's answer, as the scribe recorded it, was not political. It was that they were hungry, that they had come to that place because they were starving and thirsty, that they had no clothing, no oil, no fish, no vegetables. Somebody should write to the king. Somebody should write to the vizier. And until then, they were not going back. They stayed. Rations came. Eventually, after negotiation, then it happened again. More than once. Over the following months. That is what the temple wall is covering. On the wall, a king triumphant over the enemies of the world. In a journal kept a short walk away. A government that cannot reliably feed the men working on the king's own tomb. And workmen who have discovered that the one thing they own is their labor. The reign ended in a conspiracy. A set of documents known as the Judicial Papyrus of Turin records the trial of a group accused of plotting to kill Ramesses III, organized within the royal household and involving a secondary wife who intended to place her own son on the throne. The accused were tried and condemned. In 2012, a study using computed tomography scanning of the mummy identified as Ramesses III reported a deep cut across the throat, consistent with the plot having succeeded. After him, 8 more kings named Ramesses follow, and their reigns record steady deterioration. Grain prices in the documents rise sharply. Egyptian control in Nubia and in Canaan slips away. Payments to the temples continue, and their share of the country's land and labor grows. And the royal tombs began to be robbed, systematically, by the people who lived nearest to them. We have the interrogation records. Under Ramesses IX, an investigation into tomb robbery produced confessions, and one of them describes the inside of a royal burial from the point of view of the men breaking into it. A stonemason named Amenpanufa, questioned about a tomb in the Western Hills, described how they got through into the burial chamber, what they found on the bodies of the king and queen, the gold and the amulets and the coffins. He described stripping it, and he described what they did afterward, which was to divide the metal into shares, 1 share each. Read that beside Mera's shift log from chapter 3, and you can see the whole arc of this civilization in 2 documents. Both are working men's paperwork about royal tombs. In one, a supervisor is delivering the stone. In the other, a stonemason is explaining to a court how he and his partners split the gold. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the country divided again. Kings ruled in the delta from a city called Tanis. In the south, the high priests of Ammon at Thebes governed as effective rulers in their own right, dating documents by their own years of office and commanding their own troops. The god that the empire had enriched for 500 years now controlled the southern half of the country. There is a document from the very end of this period that captures the new reality more sharply than any inscription. It is called the Report of Wenamun, and it tells of an Egyptian official sent to the Lebanese coast to buy timber for the sacred bark of Amun. Whether it is an authentic report or a literary composition is debated, and it hardly matters, because either way it reflects how Egyptians of the time understood their position. When Amun is robbed on the way, when he reaches the port of Byblos, the local ruler keeps him waiting for weeks, then refuses to hand over timber without payment in advance, and lectures him that Egypt's authority over his coast is a thing of the past. For 500 years, an Egyptian envoy on that coast had represented the strongest state in the world. Now he was a man in a foreign harbor, being told to pay first. Egypt did not come through the Bronze Age collapse intact. It came through alive, which is a different thing. And it never again ruled an empire on that scale. The distinction between surviving a catastrophe and recovering from one is one of the more useful things this period has to teach. Chapter 11. The Black Pharaohs. In 1862, an Egyptologist working at Gebel Barkal, a flat-topped sandstone mountain beside the Nile in what is now Sudan, recovered a large granite stela carrying one of the longest royal inscriptions ever found in the Egyptian language. It was written for a king named Pa, and it is the account of how he conquered Egypt. The mountain it stood at is roughly 700 miles south of Cairo. The inscription is in Egyptian hieroglyphs, written in an accomplished and deliberately archaizing form of the language. A Nubian king, using Egypt's own classical idiom, describing his conquest of Egypt as a religious duty. To understand how that happened, go back to where we left Nubia in chapter 6. Egypt had crushed the kingdom of Kush at the start of the New Kingdom and occupied Nubia for 500 years. During that occupation, Egyptian temples were built across the region. Egyptian gods were worshipped there. Nubian elites were educated in Egyptian ways, and Amun in particular took root at Gebel Barkal, a mountain that Egyptians and Nubians alike came to regard as a home of the god. Then, Egyptian power withdrew during the collapse of the last chapter, and the temples stayed. Over the following centuries, a new Kushite state formed around the city of Napata. Near that same mountain, its rulers built pyramids, worshipped Amun, wrote in hieroglyphs, and understood themselves as the proper heirs of a tradition Egypt had brought them and then abandoned. By the 8th century before Christ, Egypt was a patchwork. Libyan-descended dynasties in the delta, local rulers in the middle of the country, and the Theban priesthood in the south. No single authority. Constant rivalry. And from the Kushite point of view, a sacred landscape in the hands of people who were not maintaining it properly. Pa came north around 727 years before Christ. What makes his stela extraordinary is not the campaign narrative. Though that is detailed, it is the religious framing and the specific behavior he chose to record. He describes purifying himself before entering temples. He describes celebrating festivals correctly. When he takes the city of Hermopolis after a siege, he records inspecting the stables of the defeated ruler, and he expresses anger at the condition of the horses, which had been left to go hungry. He put that on a monument. A conquering king, listing among his grievances that his enemy had mistreated horses. He also, having taken the country, went home. Pa returned to Napata and was buried there, under a pyramid, in the Nubian cemetery at El Kuru, with horses buried nearby in their own graves. Kushite pyramids deserve a moment, because they are visually distinct, and there are a great many of them. Modern Sudan contains hundreds of Kushite pyramids, and depending on how they are counted, it may hold more surviving pyramid structures than Egypt does. They are smaller, considerably steeper, and built to a different plan, with a chapel attached at the base. A Nubian dynasty revived the pyramid as a royal tomb, roughly 800 years after Egyptian kings had stopped building them. The dynasty Pa founded is counted as the 25th, and its most consequential ruler was Taharqa, who took the throne around 690 years before Christ and ruled for about 26 years. Taharqa built on a scale Egypt had not seen since Ramesses. He added to Karnak, including a colonnade in the first court where one enormous column still stands. He built and restored temples across Egypt and Nubia. Under him, the country was united. The old religious institutions were funded, And there was a genuine artistic revival, with sculptors deliberately studying and imitating the styles of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. That revival is a strange and moving thing. Foreign kings ruling Egypt, ordering their artists to look back 2,000 years and copy the work of the Pyramid Age. Because that was what proper Egyptian art looked like. Their own sculpture is unmistakable. Kushite royal portraits show broad features and a distinct headdress with a double cobra at the brow, claiming kingship over both Egypt and Kush. They do not attempt to look like New Kingdom pharaohs. They are Nubian faces wearing Egyptian kingship, stated openly rather than disguised. Taharqa also involved himself in the politics of the Levant, and that is what destroyed him. The rising power of the age was Assyria, a militarized state in northern Mesopotamia with the most effective army in the world. Siege engineering, mass deportation as policy, and a habit of recording its own brutality in detail. Egypt, under the Kushite kings, supported small states in Canaan that were resisting Assyrian expansion, which made Egypt an Assyrian problem. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded and took Memphis around 671 years before Christ. Assyrian records state that members of the royal family were captured and deported. Taharqa escaped south and returned when the Assyrians withdrew. His successor Tantamani retook Memphis. The Assyrians came back under Ashurbanipal, drove south, and in 663 years before Christ, they took Thebes and sacked it. Thebes had been the religious center of Egypt for 1,000 years and had never been taken by a foreign army. Assyrian accounts describe carrying off enormous quantities of gold, silver, and obelisks, and the fall of the city was remembered across the ancient Near East as a byword for total destruction. The Kushite kings withdrew to Nubia permanently. Egypt was left in the hands of a local dynasty from the delta city of Sais, installed under Assyrian oversight, which then quietly became independent as Assyrian power declined. This is the 26th dynasty, and it produced the last long period of native Egyptian self-rule in this story, running from roughly 664 to 525 years before Christ. The Site kings looked backward, deliberately and systematically. Art of this period revives Old Kingdom forms with such fidelity that individual pieces have been misdated by specialists. Religious texts were copied and standardized. Old titles were revived. The program is usually described as archaism, and it was a governing strategy as much as an aesthetic one. A dynasty with a shaky claim anchored itself in the deepest past available. They also opened the country. Greek traders were granted a settlement at Naucratis in the Delta. Greek mercenaries were hired in numbers, and some of them carved graffiti into the leg of a colossal statue at Abu Simbel while on campaign south, which is the earliest substantial Greek inscription found in Egypt. Then, in 525 years before Christ, the Persian king Cambyses II invaded and defeated the Egyptian army at Pelusium in the eastern delta. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. What that felt like from inside is preserved by one man who lived through it, and he is worth meeting properly. His name was Ujahorisnet. He was an Egyptian, a priest of the goddess Neith at Sais, and under the last native kings, he had held naval command. Then his country lost a war, and he made a decision that people in occupied places have been making ever since. He went to work for the conquerors. We know this because he had a statue made, now, in the Vatican, covered in his own account of what he did. It is a strange document to read, because it is simultaneously a career resume, a religious defense, and an argument to posterity. He says he served the Persian king. He says he composed the royal titulary for Cambyses in proper Egyptian form, which means he was the man who translated a foreign conqueror into a legitimate pharaoh. He says he petitioned the king to expel foreigners who had occupied the temple precinct at Sais, and that they were removed and the temple cleaned. He says the offerings were restored and the festivals resumed. He says he did these things because he wanted the temple to survive, and he asks to be remembered well for it. Set that beside the story most people have heard about this period. Herodotus, visiting Egypt around the middle of the 5th century before Christ, reported that Cambyses had behaved with contempt toward Egyptian religion, including killing a sacred Apis bull. Uja-Horusnet's statue presents a king adopting Egyptian titles and being instructed in proper conduct toward the temples. There is also evidence for the burial of an Apis bull with full honors during the Persian period. Both sources are real, and neither is innocent. Herodotus is reporting what Egyptians told him decades later about a conquest they resented. Uja-Horusnet is a collaborator justifying himself in stone, and he had every reason to describe the arrangement as a rescue rather than a surrender. But notice what he thought would justify him. Not loyalty to Egypt as a state, because the state was gone. He argued that he had kept the temple running, the offerings coming, the festivals on the calendar. He believed, and he expected his readers to agree, that the system mattered more than who was holding it. Persian rule lasted, with interruptions, for most of the next 2 centuries. There were serious revolts, and there was a period of about 60 years in the 4th century when Egyptian dynasties re-established independence, before Persia returned in 343 years before Christ. So look at the shape of these 4 centuries. Egypt was ruled by Libyans, then Nubians, then Assyrians, then briefly by Egyptians, then by Persians. Through all of it the temples operated. The scribal tradition continued. The gods were served, and each new set of rulers adopted the same titles, wrote in the same script, and built in the same style. The Kushite kings are the sharpest illustration. The people Egypt had once conquered and colonized came back as the most devoted custodians of Egyptian religion in centuries, and it took an Assyrian army to make them let go. That is what a civilization looks like when it has outlived its own political independence. The state can be captured. The system keeps running, because the system has become larger than anyone who holds it. Chapter 12. Egypt in Greek. There was a city where the librarians searched incoming ships. According to a story preserved by later writers, vessels docking at Alexandria had to surrender any books on board. The books were taken to the library, copied, and the copies were returned to the owners, while the originals were kept. Whether the practice was quite that systematic cannot be verified, and the account comes from sources writing well after the fact. But something like it was happening, because the Ptolemaic kings were spending serious money acquiring texts, and the institution's reputation rested on the claim that it held everything. Egypt had kept records for 3,000 years. It had never tried to collect the world. Alexander of Macedon arrived in Egypt in 332 years before Christ, having already defeated the Persian king in battle in Syria. The Persian governor of Egypt surrendered without fighting. Egyptians had spent 2 centuries under Persian rule, with periods of revolt, and a conqueror, promising respect for the temples, was an improvement on the arrangement they had. Alexander sacrificed to Egyptian gods at Memphis. He traveled across the desert to the oracle at Siwa, an isolated oasis far to the west, where the priests of Amun apparently greeted him in terms appropriate to a pharaoh, which in Greek understanding meant being addressed as a son of the god. What was said inside is not recorded by any witness, and the surviving accounts are later and vary. What is certain is that Alexander treated the visit as significant afterward, and, on the Mediterranean coast, at a site with a good natural harbour sheltered by an island called Pharaohs, he ordered a city founded and named after himself. Then he left, and never came back alive. He died in Babylon in 323 years before Christ, at the age of 32, and his empire was divided among his generals. The general who took Egypt was Ptolemy, and he did something that shows exactly how well he understood the situation. He intercepted Alexander's funeral procession, which was traveling toward Macedonia, and brought the body to Egypt. Possession of the dead conqueror was a legitimacy claim, and Ptolemy knew it. He founded a dynasty that ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 to 30 years before Christ, and every male ruler in it was named Ptolemy. The governing arrangement they built is the key to this chapter. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt as Greeks and presented themselves to Egyptians as pharaohs. On temple walls, in the traditional style, they appear in Egyptian dress, making offerings to Egyptian gods, with their names in cartouches. In Alexandria and in their correspondence, they were Macedonian Greek kings running a Greek court, in a Greek city, in Greek. The temples they built are genuinely impressive and genuinely Egyptian in form. The temple of Horus at Edfu, largely Ptolemaic, is the best preserved major temple in Egypt. Dendera and Kom Ombo are also substantially Ptolemaic. If you have seen photographs of Egyptian temple interiors with complete roofs and crisply carved walls, you have very likely been looking at Ptolemaic work rather than anything from the age of Ramesses. So the gods were funded and the ancient forms continued. But administration, taxation, the army officer class, the land grants, and the whole apparatus of power operated in Greek. And Greek settlers were brought in and given land. Egypt was now a country where the rulers and the ruled did not share a language. Alexandria became something the ancient world had not seen, laid out on a grid, with a great harbour, a Greek population alongside a large Egyptian population, and one of the most significant Jewish communities anywhere. It grew into the largest city of the Mediterranean world. Off its harbour stood the lighthouse on the island of Pharaohs, among the tallest structures then in existence, listed as one of the wonders of the ancient world, and it stood for over a millennium before earthquakes brought it down. And there was the Mauseon, an institution for scholars supported by royal funds, with the library attached. The library is the most mythologized institution in ancient history. So a few cautions. There is no reliable figure for how many rolls it held. Ancient estimates vary wildly, and none is trustworthy. The famous story of a single catastrophic fire destroying all of human knowledge in one night is not supported either. The institution appears to have declined through multiple episodes of damage, political disruption, and lost patronage, rather than one clean cinematic destruction. What is not mythical is the work done there. Eratosthenes, working in Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, calculated the circumference of the earth from the difference in the sun's angle at 2 locations and came remarkably close to the actual figure. Euclid's systematic work on geometry is associated with the city. Later, Ptolemy the astronomer, no relation to the dynasty, produced the astronomical system that governed European and Islamic understanding of the heavens for 1400 years. For roughly 3 centuries, Alexandria was one of the great intellectual capitals of the Mediterranean world, and it was in Egypt, and almost none of it was Egyptian. That tension is the story of the dynasty. Over time, revolts broke out in the Egyptian south, including a period in the late 3rd and early 2nd centuries before Christ, when native rulers held Upper Egypt for about 2 decades. The Ptolemies responded by conceding more to the priesthoods, and the record of those concessions is where our single most important object comes from. In 1799, French soldiers working on fortifications near the town of Rashid in the Delta, which Europeans called Rosetta, found a broken slab of dark stone carrying 3 blocks of writing. The top section is in hieroglyphs. The middle is in Demotic, the everyday cursive Egyptian script of the later periods. The bottom is in Greek. The content is a priestly decree issued in 196 years before Christ. In the reign of Ptolemy V, recording honors granted to the king in exchange for tax relief and benefits given to the temples. As a document, it is administrative. As an object, it is the key that reopened 3,000 years of history. Because by the time it was found, nobody on earth could read the top third of it. We will return to that. For now, hold the fact that the Rosetta Stone exists because a Greek dynasty needed to buy the loyalty of Egyptian priests and had to publish the deal in both their languages. Which brings us to the last ruler of the dynasty. Cleopatra VII came to the throne in 51 years before Christ. At around 18, ruling jointly with a younger brother in an arrangement that collapsed into civil war almost immediately. 3 things about her are worth stating plainly, because popular understanding gets all 3 wrong. She was not Egyptian in ancestry. She was Macedonian Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy, from a family that had practiced sibling marriage for generations. There is genuine uncertainty about the identity of her mother and of one grandmother. So other ancestry is possible. But there is no evidence for it, and confident claims in either direction go beyond what the sources allow. She was reportedly the first ruler of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. Plutarch says she spoke many languages and rarely needed an interpreter. 300 years of Greek kings in Egypt, and she was apparently the first to bother. And we do not know what she looked like. The images surviving from her lifetime are coins and a small number of sculptures. And coin portraits are stylized political statements rather than likenesses. Everything else comes from Roman writers describing an enemy of Rome after Rome had won, working in a tradition that portrayed her as a dangerous foreign seductress in order to explain why Roman men had fought each other over her. Plutarch, writing more than a century after her death, is explicit that her appearance was not what made her formidable, and points instead to her voice, her intelligence, and her presence in conversation. Every confident description of Cleopatra's face is either invention or the propaganda of the people who destroyed her. Her political situation was brutal, and she read it accurately. Rome was the only power that mattered, and Egypt was a wealthy prize that had so far escaped annexation. Her strategy was to attach herself to whichever Roman was winning and convert that relationship into Egyptian independence. She allied with Julius Caesar when he arrived in Alexandria in 48 years before Christ, pursuing his rival Pompey. She had a son whom she named Caesarion and presented as Caesar's. After Caesar was assassinated in 44 years before Christ, she allied with Mark Antony, who controlled the eastern half of the Roman world, and had 3 children with him. Antony's rival Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, ran the propaganda campaign that decided the outcome. The charge was not exactly that Antony was a traitor. It was that he had been captured by a foreign queen and intended to move the center of Roman power east. Octavian was able to present a war against another Roman as a war in defense of Rome against Egypt. The decisive naval battle was fought at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, in 31 years before Christ. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated and withdrew to Egypt. Octavian followed the next year. They both died in Alexandria in 30 years before Christ. Antony, by his own hand. Cleopatra's death is traditionally attributed to snake venom, an account that appears in ancient sources and was questioned even in antiquity. Poison of some kind is the usual alternative. The truth is not recoverable. Caesarion was killed on Octavian's orders. Cleopatra's other children were taken to Rome and paraded, and her daughter was later married to a client king in North Africa. Egypt became a Roman province, and not an ordinary one. Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, made it a personal possession, administered by his own appointee. and Roman senators were forbidden to enter it without permission. Egypt's grain was too important to Rome's food supply to let any ambitious rival control it. That is the end of Egyptian independence. 3,000 years after Narmer, it is not the end of ancient Egypt. And the distance between those two statements is the subject of the final chapter. Chapter 13. The Last Sentence. The latest dated hieroglyphic inscription anyone has found was carved on the 24th of August in the year 394, on a gate at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, near the first cataract in the far south of Egypt. We can date it that precisely because it records the day. Nobody who carved it knew it would be the last. A priest recorded an offering in the traditional script, the way that script had been used for something close to 3,500 years. Then nobody did it again. Egypt had been conquered many times by then and had absorbed every conqueror. What finally closed the ancient world here was not an army. It was the failure of a small professional community to replace itself. Under Roman rule, the country functioned as an imperial province and a grain supply. Egyptian religion continued, and in some ways it traveled. The cult of Isis spread across the Roman Empire, with temples as far away as Britain and Germany. Roman emperors appear on Egyptian temple walls in pharaonic dress, making offerings, exactly as the Ptolemies had. But the institutions that sustained the writing system were shrinking. Hieroglyphic literacy had always lived inside the temples, held by a small professional class funded by temple estates. Roman administration reduced those endowments and brought the priesthoods under state supervision. Each generation, fewer men were trained. Then Christianity spread through Egypt. Deeply and early, Egypt produced the desert monastic movement that shaped Christian practice across the world. And the Egyptian language survived the transition. But it changed clothes. Written in Greek letters with a few additional signs borrowed from Demotic, it became what we call Coptic, which is still used liturgically today. That is the crucial point. Egyptian was never a dead language. What died was the script. In the year 391, the Emperor Theodosius I issued legislation against pagan worship across the empire. Temples closed. Philae, far to the south, held on longer than most because of its location and its Nubian worshippers. And it was finally closed under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. At some point in those centuries, the chain of teaching failed, and no community remained that could read the script fluently. For roughly 1,400 years after that, the monuments of Egypt stood covered in writing that no living person could understand. Consider what that means as a situation. The pyramids were visible. The temples were visible. Obelisks had been carried to Rome and stood in public squares. Every inch of it was labeled, and the labels said nothing. Into that silence poured invention. Medieval and Renaissance European scholars generally believed the hieroglyphs were symbolic, that each sign encoded a mystical concept rather than a sound. A 17th century Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher produced elaborate translations on that assumption. And they were entirely wrong. The idea that Egypt was a repository of hidden mystical wisdom is not an ancient Egyptian idea. It is a European idea, invented to fill a gap left by illiteracy. That vacuum is the direct ancestor of every strange theory attached to Egypt today. The recovery began with the stone from the last chapter. The Rosetta Stone was found in 1799 during the French expedition to Egypt, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, which had brought scholars along with the army. After the French were defeated by the British, the stone was surrendered under the terms of the capitulation of Alexandria in 1801 and taken to London, where it has been in the British Museum ever since. Copies circulated widely, and scholars across Europe went to work. The English polymath Thomas Young made real progress, establishing that some hieroglyphs were phonetic and correctly identifying the name of Ptolemy in the cartouches. The breakthrough belongs to Jean-François Champollion, a French scholar who had studied Coptic seriously since childhood. And that background is why he succeeded where others stalled. He understood that Coptic was the descendant of the ancient language, which gave him a living vocabulary to test his readings against. In 1822, working with the Rosetta Stone and with an obelisk inscription that supplied the name Cleopatra, he demonstrated that the script was neither purely symbolic nor purely alphabetic. It was mixed. Some signs stood for sounds, some for whole words, and some were classifiers indicating what category a word belonged to. He announced the results in a letter to the French Academy in September of 1822. 14 centuries of silence ended in a document read out to a scholarly society, and a civilization began speaking again. What came next was not entirely admirable, and this story does not work if we skip it. The 19th century brought an enormous European appetite for Egyptian antiquities, and the trade that supplied it operated with essentially no regard for context. Obelisks were shipped to Paris, London, and New York. Tomb contents were sold. Consuls of European powers assembled collections that became the founding holdings of major museums. Mummies were unwrapped as public entertainment. Some of the men involved were serious scholars. Some were treasure hunters. The distinction was often unclear at the time. The discipline eventually grew up. Flinders Petrie, working from the 1880s onward, introduced systematic excavation methods and insisted that ordinary pottery, carefully recorded in its layers, was more informative than gold. That principle is the foundation of modern archaeology. The most famous discovery came in November of 1922, when Howard Carter, funded by Lord Carnarvon, found the steps leading down to the tomb of Tutankhamun. It was the first substantially intact royal burial ever found, and clearing it took about a decade. Then Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo in April of 1923, of blood poisoning following an infected mosquito bite, and the newspapers of the world invented a curse. There was no curse inscription in the tomb. Studies of the people present at the opening have found no unusual mortality pattern, and Carter himself, who had more exposure to that tomb than anyone alive, died in 1939 at the age of 64. The curse was a press invention, driven partly by resentment at the exclusive newspaper contract Carnarvon had signed, and it has outlived every fact that contradicts it. Egyptology today looks different again. Excavation is directed by Egyptian institutions and Egyptian archaeologists in partnership with foreign teams. And the questions have shifted. Less about kings and gold, more about workers, diet, disease, trade, climate, and the lives of people who left no monuments. Techniques that did not exist a generation ago are routine, including computed tomography, scanning of mummies, isotope analysis of teeth to determine where an individual grew up, and remote sensing that has located structures buried under fields. The Grand Egyptian Museum near Giza, built over decades to house the Tutankhamun collection in full for the first time, represents more than a building. It is Egypt taking custody of the account of itself. The question of objects held abroad has not gone away, and it should not. The Rosetta Stone is in London. The bust of Nefertiti is in Berlin. Egyptian authorities have requested their return. Arguments for keeping them, about conservation and access, have been made for over a century and have grown less persuasive as Egyptian museums and Egyptian scholarship have grown stronger. Nobody has to resolve that question today, but nobody honest can call it settled. So let us finish where this began. We have spent this story with the largest objects human beings had ever made. And they were never the point. Egypt built pyramids at monumental scale for about a century. Out of 3,000 years, it stopped. Not because it forgot how, but because the resources, the priorities, and the political structure that produced them had changed. The stone rose and fell with the state, like a reading on an instrument. What actually ran for 3 millennia was smaller and nearly invisible. A method for measuring the flood so a harvest could be anticipated. A script that could record who owed what. A sheet of pressed reed that let a decision travel 700 miles. A cubit rod so 2 crews could build the same wall. Avod. Mart. That made keeping all of it running the same thing as keeping the world in order. And a class of people trained to hold the record. That system carried Egypt through repeated failures and divisions of central government. It survived climate catastrophe, foreign rule, occupation, and the disappearance of nearly every other power in its world. It was strong enough that conquerors from Nubia, Macedonia and Rome all decided the sensible move was to put on the crown and keep it running. Udya Horisnet, defending his own collaboration in stone, understood the arrangement exactly. He did not claim to have saved Egypt. He claimed to have kept the offerings coming. And then it ended. Not with an army, but when the last teachers of the script ran out of students. The Rosetta Stone is not an impressive object. It is a broken slab, about the size of a tabletop, carrying a tax decree nobody would otherwise remember. It sits behind glass in a room where most people walk past it toward the mummies. That piece of granite gave humanity back 3,000 years of its own memory. Because somebody had the sense to write the same thing twice, in 2 languages, so that both sides could check. Civilizations are not remembered because of what they build. They are remembered because of what stays readable.